Historical Equity Total Returns, originally published on marketunpack.com. It's common knowledge that the stock market goes up 8% per year over the long term. But does it really? Let's look at the equity growth rates in several different countries starting at different points in the last century. This discussion is a continuation of crash recovery, where we saw some anecdotal evidence that while equity growth is real, it's also uneven with down periods that can last decades. We'll now look at the data systematically to figure out just how bad and frequent these downturns are. We're using the per-country data from Macrofinance Lab. Specifically, we use the Equity Total Return, EQTR, and Consumer Price Index, CPI, columns. For example, here are the plots of the two series for the Netherlands on the same graph. We convert from Equity TR to Equity Index and from CPI to inflation as necessary. Figure 1. The Equity Index in nominal terms, blue, and the CPI, orange, for the Netherlands from 1920 to 2020. The Equity Index increased from 100 to 22,800. The CPI increased from 12 to 180. Both lines are uneven with many sudden rises and falls. Figure 2. The equity return rate in nominal terms, blue, and the inflation rate, orange, for the Netherlands between 1920 and 2020. Both rates were volatile, with equity returns hitting minus 50% and plus 150% at times, while the inflation kept to the plus minus 15% interval. The data isn't easy to interpret as is, and we'll crunch it later, but first a word of warning. Our data spans a century. Not only has the world changed significantly over this time, but so have collection techniques. Worse still, we'll be comparing different countries who have always used different statistical methodologies. While the database was compiled by researchers who have made every effort to normalize the data points and make them comparable, I'd still be wary of drawing hard conclusions. In other words, what we're doing here isn't quite as bad as comparing apples to oranges, but we're definitely comparing different kinds of apples. Section: Real Returns. The first challenge in interpreting the data is that we need to account for inflation. After all, if your investments go up by 10%, but everything else also goes up by 10%, then you're no better off. To do this, we subtracted the two series in Figure 2. Real returns are total returns minus inflation. Note that inflation was sometimes negative during the first half of the 20th century, so it actually increased real returns. Figure 3. The equity index in real terms for the Netherlands between 1920 and 2019. The equity index increased from 86 to 352,000. Figure 4. The equity return rate in real terms for the Netherlands from 1920 to 2019. The rate was very volatile, hitting minus 50% and plus 100% at times. The real graphs have a similar shape to the nominal ones, but trend higher. This is because the negative inflation at the beginning of the series has an outsized impact when compounded over a century. Note that we're using the Consumer Price Index to compute inflation here. On the one hand, this is right since the index attempts to capture the rate at which broad prices increased. On the other hand, it's a bit weird to adjust the price of equities by the rate at which milk got more expensive. The CPI is good enough for the kind of general analysis we're doing, but a similar case could be made for using the risk-free rate on government bonds or the inflation rate for real estate. Section: Many periods. We started by considering the statement that equities go up by 8% per year over the long term. The actual compounded annual growth rate, CAGR, for the Netherlands was 8.8%, so that's pretty close. However, 100 years is a strange period to consider. It happens to be the span of our data, but it's far too long for any practical use. I'm certainly not going to be alive a century from now, so knowing that investments in an index tracker will go up by 8% is not very useful. Even 50 years is pushing it as far as I'm concerned, since I hope to have cashed out by then. Instead, I think a more reasonable time frame is 25 years or shorter. Another advantage of using shorter intervals is that there were many such periods in the last century. If we were considering 100-year intervals, there's only one, so the only statement we could make is investing in 1920 would have yielded a CAGR of 8.8% over the next 100 years. If we instead consider 25-year intervals, we can make many statements like investing in 1920 would have yielded a CAGR of 3.2% over the next 25 years. Investing in 1940 would have yielded a CAGR of 7.2%, and so on. Given these, we can then plot a histogram to see how frequent 3% or 7% CAGRs have been. So let's do that, but let's build up the length of the intervals starting with 1 year long. Figure 5. Histogram of the frequencies of total return CAGRs observed when investing in Netherlands equities for 1 year over the period 1920 to 2019. The colors of the rectangles represent how recent the year was, with blue denoting old and orange denoting recent. The black vertical line is at 0. The dotted green line represents the geometric mean of all CAGRs. Above is the frequency histogram of real total return CAGRs when investing in Netherlands equities for 1 year. There are 100 rectangles, one for each year. The colors are a gradient from blue 1920 to orange 2019. The nice thing about this graph compared to figure 4 is that we can immediately draw some conclusions. We see that the distribution is kind of bell-shaped and that the mean is illustrated by the dotted green line. However, this is not obviously any known distribution. We see that the returns were very spread out, ranging from -50% to 100%, but those were outliers. Most measurements fell between -20% and +40%. Focusing on the colors, we see that blue and orange are mostly mixed up, so there's no clear historical trend in the evolution of yearly CAGRs. That said, there's a lot of orange to the right of the dotted green line, showing that recent performance has been above average. We also see that the worst year for equities was not around World War II as one might have assumed, but was in fact much more recent. It was the 2008 crash. Figure 6. Histogram of the frequencies of real total return CAGRs observed when investing in Netherlands equities for 5 years over the period 1920 to 2015. The colors of the rectangles represent how recent the year was, with blue denoting old and orange denoting recent. The black vertical line is at 0. The dotted green line represents the geometric mean of all CAGRs. Increasing our investment horizon to 5 years, the distribution narrows and fits entirely between -12% and +30%. Looking at the colors, we see that recent years were all between -12% and +14%, and the entire tail to the right of the graph are the years from the 1930s and 1970s. Figure 7. Histogram of the frequencies of real total return CAGRs observed when investing in Netherlands equities for 10 years for the period 1920 to 2010. The colors of the rectangles represent how recent the year was, with blue denoting old and orange denoting recent. The black vertical line is at 0. The dotted green line represents the geometric mean of all CAGRs. Increasing the horizon to 10 years narrows the distribution further, but doesn't change its shape much. It may be possible to conclude that investing for 5 and 10 years have the same return profiles, albeit with different volatilities, but that requires further study. Figure 8. Histogram of the frequencies of real total return CAGRs observed when investing in Netherlands equities for 25 years over the period 1920 to 1995. The colors of the rectangles represent how recent the year was, with blue denoting old and orange denoting recent. The black vertical line is at 0. The dotted green line represents the geometric mean of all CAGRs. Increasing further to 25 years both narrows the distribution and also moves it entirely to the right of the 0 line. The rightward drift is unsurprising given that the mean is around 6%. We also see that the poor returns are mostly from before 1970. The great returns are from the 1970s and 1980s, and the average returns are from the early 1990s. Taking a step back, we've added nuance to the general statement that equities grow at 8% per year. For the Netherlands, the average is actually about 6.5% for 25-year investment horizons, but the distribution of possible returns is fairly wide. Since these are real inflation-adjusted returns, even 1% is real growth, but the absolute differences in total returns, not growth rates, between the distribution edges are stark. The low-end growth would have turned 100 into 144 over 25 years, while the high-end growth would have turned 100 into 3,750. I think this shows that it's worth thinking past the folkloric 8% figure. Section: Country Comparison. So far, we've looked at just the Netherlands. Let's see the 25-year histograms for more countries. Figure 9. Histograms of the frequencies of real total return CAGRs observed when investing in equities in different countries for 25 years over the period 1920 to 1995. The colors of the rectangles represent how recent the year was, with blue denoting old and orange denoting recent. The black vertical line is at 0. The dotted green line represents the geometric mean of all CAGRs. The graphs all have the same axis, so they are comparable by sight. The immediate observation is that the graphs are very different. Investing in the equity markets of different countries yields different results. But before we discuss this further, another word of warning. Above are the graphs of 15 countries. Today we'd call these developed nations, and in the 1920s they would have been called industrialized countries. They are basically the large countries of Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and the USA. They are not a representative sample of the world, since Eastern Europe, the rest of the Americas, all of Africa, and most of Asia are missing. Even in the focused regions, some countries like Germany are missing. Given this, it would be folly to point out similarities between the graphs and generalize. Contrasting the histograms to point out differences should be fine, though. The first difference lies in the shape of the histograms. Australia's is fairly narrow with only 8% between ends. Japan's is the widest with 30% between ends, and the rest fall somewhere in between. Most of the distributions are somewhat bell-shaped, but the ones that are spread out end up looking flat. The second difference is the positioning of each histogram. Quite a few of them are to the right of the zero line, but not all. Similarly, there are several with average returns of around 6.5%, but that was far from universal, with some markets like Portugal and France yielding zero or even negative returns. From this alone, it's clear that a statement like equity investments grow at X% per year over the long term requires specifying a country, because it is definitely not universally true. The third difference is the distribution of colors. It's fairly obvious that for all of the Central European countries, the leftward part of each histogram is predominantly blue, indicating that the 25-year periods starting before 1965 were the bad times. Perhaps unsurprisingly, having your city strategically bombed during World War II is not conducive to a thriving economy. Japan's negative growth is even more extreme before 1950, presumably because having your cities nuked is even worse. It's also clear that Japan's rapid recovery started in the 1960s, while Europe's was still a decade out. In contrast, the signs of the war are not at all obvious on the Australian and US histograms, indicating perhaps that even the damages of a massive war are ablated by the 25-year investing horizons, as long as the country's physical infrastructure remains intact. It's also worth noting that the colors tend to cluster together in all the graphs. This is unsurprising, as investing for 25 years starting one year is likely to have similar returns as starting in the next year. It's clear that both good and bad times usually last more than 1 year. In most of the graphs, the recent years have been above average, but Japan stands out as a stark reminder that this need not be true. The lost decades that started in 1990 all yielded negative or small equity returns. Note that life in Japan itself was not bad by any means during this time, which just goes to show that you can have a country that functions while still having poor stock market performance. Looking back, we have added extra dimensions to the simple statement about equity growth. First, we showed that growth is not uniform across time, even with long investment horizons. Then, we showed that growth distribution isn't the same in all countries. The conclusion here is negative rather than positive. General statements about equity returns are unlikely to be universally true and should be taken with a grain of salt. Section: Other Considerations. One feature that all of our graphs had in common is that they are more or less continuous, but even this is not always true. Had we considered any country that had a communist revolution, then we would have seen a total loss of capital in any investment window that crossed the start of the new regime, followed by a period of zero returns while private property ceased to exist. Even in the absence of a regime change like communism, certain groups of people might still not have benefited from market growth. For example, if you had invested in Netherlands equities in 1935, you'd have gotten an 8.5% CAGR over 25 years. But perhaps not if you were Jewish and were still in the country in 1940 when Nazi Germany invaded. For that matter, you might also have lost everything if you were Dutch and didn't cooperate with the invaders. Conclusion. This all started with the statement that equities go up by 8% per year over the long term. This is usually given as the justification for why putting your money in index funds makes sense. It is certainly the explanation I accepted when I started investing, and I must still believe it to some degree, because half of my capital remains in index trackers. Funnily enough, another oft-repeated statement is that past performance is not indicative of future results, but this seems to contradict the first statement. I guess that one could claim that averaging over many past years is good enough to predict the average of many future years, but that's not at all obvious to me. Nevertheless, in the absence of a crystal ball or a really good predictive model, history is all we have available to guess at the future. So, what does history tell us? I think it tells us that, barring a devastating event like war, equities do indeed grow over long investment horizons, but the rates of growth can vary widely across years and countries. It's also possible for growth to just stall for decades like in Japan. Ultimately, I think the only thing to do is to pay attention and try to cash out in time. After all, even the Japan 1990 crash took several years to fully materialize. The data and references used in this post are available on marketunpack.com. Thank you for listening.